Hughes.
Thank you. I want to thank Dr. Gooch and the group here, the Young Americans for Liberty. I want to thank especially Jonathan. He is just probably one of the greatest and most tireless advocates for liberty I've ever known. He is never afraid to challenge someone, but he is always willing to listen to opposing viewpoints. And if it weren't for Jonathan and his patience, I would not be here today. I don't want to seem off topic, but I do want to talk a little bit about my own conversion. I think that within the Liberty Movement, it's important for us to look to bring others to our side. It's not enough to just get together and sort of reinforce our own beliefs. And I came to my belief system a little older than maybe some of you here. And I think that when we approach people, sometimes it's hard to understand why they're holding so tightly to a lot of conflicting views. And I think that maybe I can touch upon that. But I also want to talk about the conversion of our country under the Constitution and what that meant to us as individuals, what it meant then and what it means today. And it is true that the subtitle of my book was A Mandate to Restore the Constitution. But even then, I was beginning to feel that the Constitution maybe was not all it's cracked up to be. So first, I'm going to just give you a short explanation of how a passively neocon homeschooling mother transformed into an ardent opponent of all state power. And then I'm going to talk about the history of the Constitution and how it's transformed us. I want to share with you how I got here. The first lesson I think that you can take away from my conversion is that sometimes a seed you plant sprouts in your absence. When you speak to someone, if they don't accept what you have to say immediately, don't be certain that you haven't had an impact. When I met Jonathan, I was reading P.J. O'Rourke's book, Eat the Rich, and it had nothing to do with any political beliefs or devotion on my part. I was pretty apolitical. But The Bachelor's Home Companion had been absolutely hilarious, so I read all of his books after that. But Jonathan saw that I was reading something tangentially related to economics, and it was like a starter pistol went off, and he was off and running. The sad truth is, I did nothing with what Jonathan told me at the time. I was one of those people that some of you probably talk to on a regular basis. You offer perfectly logical, watertight defense of liberty, and they still walk away convinced that somehow it wouldn't work. I can't be sure, but there's a good possibility that when Jonathan suggested we could live without compulsory taxation, I asked who would all part of Obama's plan to Nazify America. But doing them no favors, the Democratic underground was calling for me to be put in prison because I had called Obama a socialist, which is clearly a code word to disguise my racism, and therefore a hate crime. But for me, this was a confusing time, and my default position whenever I'm confused or concerned is to read, and I read a lot. So I dug out the link Jonathan had given me, and I went to this website because I remembered from months prior this guy who seemed so crazy at the time, but he had told me that it was beyond left and right, that there was something about the state inherently that was evil and unrestrainable, and it had begun to comport with my reality. And so I did go to Mises, and I began a long journey to where I am today. And so I guess the next lesson I want you to take away from this is that for some of us it is really hard. We do not grow up and find this early on. I think that it's no coincidence that the liberty movement is full of young people. And I don't believe that it has to do with drug legalization or even just the natural rebelliousness of youth, so much as the fact that young people from the time of children are absolutely capable of spotting hypocrisy from a mile away. And so I think, that they don't buy that do as I say, not as I do kind of thing. And it's easy for them to see, say a right-wing parent who says, man, the feds have no business telling me what kind of toilet I can buy. The Constitution doesn't say anything about toilets. But those same parents are begging the feds to do something about all these gays marrying, even though the Constitution also doesn't say anything about marriage. And it's no less of a hypocrisy when your parent is a left-winger who claims to value peace and individual liberty, but has an Obama-Biden sticker on their car while these guys are bombing the Middle East and assembling a kill list in Washington. So the problem is that as you get older, I think you have to live with a lot of compromise. You learn that the world is not a perfect place. You learn to go along to get along. You've got a family to take care of. And it's not so much that the hypocrisy alarm breaks or goes away. It's just that it becomes white noise in the background. Hypocrisy is all around you, and if you paid attention to it every time, you would just go crazy. So I know now, on this side of the fence, how hard it is to deal with people who hold these completely contradictory views. And they hold to them so tightly, even though they can be perfectly reasonable and intelligent in every other area of their life. And you talk to them and you think, my God, how can you believe this and also believe that? I have a little analogy that I hope will help you understand where we come from. Imagine you get your first house and you start decorating it with just every piece of crap that your parents give you or your friends give you or you pick up from a yard sale, whatever. And, it's totally jumbled. It doesn't have any kind of reason to it, but it's yours. It's your place, and that's all that matters to you. And it could be a Victorian that you live in, and you might tell people, I live in a Victorian, even though nobody would ever believe that from the inside. And then one day, you set out to determine, well, what really is the Victorian style? And you research it, you start going to estate sales, you start bringing home things that actually fit and comport with that style, and suddenly everything is sticking out to you like an eyesore. I mean, that IKEA TV stand, the stuffed recliner, the print on the wall. I mean, none of it makes sense anymore. And you have to start getting rid of those things if you want to have a consistent style. And even though you want it, it's still hard to get rid of those things. I mean, there can be a sentimental attachment to some of the ugliest things you've lived with all your life. But, those things have to go. So for me, it was about 18 months of house cleaning. It was a transformation from comfortable to consistent, and it is very difficult. But that's the exact transformation that some of us have to go through in order to develop a mature and logically consistent political system. When you've been fed certain ideologies that have taken root from an external source, such as your parents or friends or the media, it's easy to hold those multiple contradictory views because you didn't go out looking for them. You didn't look into what they were. You just accepted them and allowed them to take root, and eventually, insidiously, they become part of your self-identity. And I would be willing to bet that about 99.9% of Americans, if you ask them, would say, yeah, I live in a Victorian. That is to say, yes, I believe in freedom and liberty. It's the greatest thing. But internally, their political philosophy is cluttered with countless little ideologies that are thoroughly irreconcilable to the concept of liberty. So for 18 months, I discarded a bunch of these clashing concepts, and I inevitably came to see that this wasn't the battle between left and right, but between freedom which I believe is the natural state of humankind, and I will believe that until someone can justify that they have the right to order me about. And we're battling not one another, but these suited, lobbied usurpers, who have the audacity to call themselves our leaders and the impudence to believe that there are betters. I did attend my first Tea Party in 2009, and believe it or not, there was actually a lot of talk about Bush and bailouts and not so much of the Obama bashing you see today. And as Jonathan said, I joined up with a local Tea Party here, but by July, it had kind of become a launching platform for Republican candidates, and I lost interest. What I really wanted was to see other people waking up as I had to the kabuki dance that was going on at every level of government and on both sides of the aisle. And instead, what I saw was a lot of people convinced that just substituting a dancer from another troupe would fix everything. And the worst part of all, the most depressing part, was I could stand in front of 1,000 people and give a speech on Hayek's road to serfdom, and they would applaud, they would stand, they would shout and cheer, and they would go right home, get on my blog, and post about how important the Patriot Act is to keeping us safe. So I guess the last lesson I want you to take away is that conversion doesn't really happen at a rally. It's a very personal journey. A person has to be looking and examining their beliefs one by one. When emotion is high, intellect takes a back seat. You need to do a quiet inventory of what you believe and make sure that it is consistent. I've met people who love Ron Paul, they hate the two-party system, they think liberty's the greatest thing in the world, they call themselves libertarians, and yet they have these kind of really inconsistent ideas rattling around in their heads still. And so we all need to be, persistently examining what we have and making sure that it all fits, that it's not contradicting one another. Now, I also want to touch on the Constitution here because one of the more popular and I think really noble efforts of the Tea Party has been these offshoot groups that want to restore the Constitution to its ostensible power to protect us from federal tyranny. And just as a little experiment, I did a Google search of the phrase, what is so great about the Constitution? And here are the top 4 answers from users around the web. You can feel free to laugh if you need to. Quote, it grants civil liberties to all Americans and gives all Americans, whether now or 300 years from now, standards on which to base their moral, judicial, and legal systems. It's important because it gives the people the power to rule everything while keeping the government in check. It keeps the government below while keeping the people on top. It's a barrier preventing the government from expanding. And finally, it provides a set of hard, fast rules for the kinds of laws the federal government may pass and sets limits so that if the legislature goes beyond those limits, the courts can strike the laws down as unconstitutional. These are the top responses from around the web. This is probably a good measure of what the average person believes the Constitution does if they ever stop to think about it at all. I know from experience that within conservative circles, the Constitution is revered as near talismanic device with the power to prevent government abuse, if only we could get the people educated on what it means. And if only we could vet and elect only leaders who respect it. And if only we had some method of removing leaders who betray its principles. Well, that's a lot of if-onlys. And I'm pretty certain each can also be found on a list of has never happens, if one exists. The unjustified optimism associated with this view rests, I believe, largely on a single misconception, that for at least some lengthy period of time in our history, the government was indeed effectively bound by the chains of the Constitution. Now, the time frame that lasted varies depending on whom you ask. Some might cite Lincoln's reign of terror as the defining moment when our union lost all pretense of voluntarism. Others might name Wilson maneuvering us into World War I, Roosevelt's New Deal, the militarization of the domestic police force in the drug war, Bush's Patriot Act, And finally, we have the completely deluded who believe Barack Obama and his executive branch kill list is some bizarre anomaly in the history of an otherwise perfectly free nation, and if we can just get someone else in there, it'll all be sunshine and lollipops again. But there really is nothing new under the sun. Today we're watching bailout after bailout to billionaires with their hands in the federal cookie jar, while average citizens lose their jobs to regulations that benefit mammoth corporations. They lose their homes to banks that are then rewarded with tax breaks, and then lose the value of their earnings to inflation benefiting the richest of the rich. Their own children are conscripted into state-funded schools where they're propagandized to idolize this nation because it is the freest in the world, and to worship the Constitution because it possesses the supernal capability of keeping us free. And the question I think it's time to ask is, did the Constitution ever make anyone free? And I believe the answer is no. Not only because it's an inanimate object without any mystical powers, but because in examining its history we find that it was from the start antithetical to the concept of human liberty. And if that's correct, there are a lot of dedicated, honest people wasting a great deal of money and effort to revive a useless corpse. We can skip back in history, past all the multitudinous violations of the Constitution after its signing. We can go back before even the Alien and Sedition Acts began imprisoning those who dared disagree with the party in power under John Adams. We can go back before the vicious taxes that precipitated the Whiskey Rebellion under Washington, all the way back to before the Constitution even existed, to one of the driving forces behind the Constitutional Convention, Shays' Rebellion. This action was sparked by events that might sound familiar. The federal government had taken out loans from wealthy merchants and the like, and they funded a war with it, and now those people wanted their money back. The direct taxation of subsistence rural farmers was clearly the correct option for getting that money. When you, a mere human, can't pay your bills, you default. Your credit rating plummets, and in the future no one's stupid enough to lend you money anymore. You don't have the option of going out and conscripting an innocent and indenturing them to your debt. But when the state defaults, that's exactly what they do. Now imagine the compounded insult for a man like Daniel Shays, having served in a war, fought to cast off the tyranny of one government, having come home without even his promised pay as many soldiers did. He now sees his neighbors being sent to debtor's prison and their belongings sold off to pay those very merchants who benefited from their blood and toil when they fought and died to cast off Great Britain's tyranny over American trade. These rebels had the insolence to close down the courts that were imprisoning them. Within their own lifetime, they had witnessed such acts against the British colonial courts lauded as heroism. But then, as now, too many believe that domination of your fellow man is acceptable so long as your team is the one doing the dominating. Meet the new boss, same as the old boss. Obviously, this kind of effrontery couldn't stand. The new boss needed tighter reins, and those reins would be crafted in the Constitutional Convention. You know, we're taught from a very young age that this gathering was, if not entirely miraculous, at the very least incredibly fortuitous. But this was no group of common men intent on securing the liberty they had wrested from the king. On the contrary, it was a small group of fairly well-off men who had seen there was too little power in the new government to subjugate the individual states and their respective citizens to the financial demands of controlling their new playing field. 55 men, mostly lawyers, some judges, virtually all of them, prominent politicians or wealthy in their own right, got together. They holed up for a few months and came out and announced they had a better way to do things. And so long as a handful of men from each of 9 of the 13 sovereign states agreed, a few million other people would just have to live with it. Lysander Spooner, writing in the aftermath of the Civil War, had the following to say about the Constitution. Quote, "There is not the slightest probability that the Constitution has a single bona fide supporter in the country. That is to say, there is not the slightest probability that there is a single man in the country who both understands what the Constitution really is and sincerely supports it for what it really is. The ostensible supporters of the Constitution, like the ostensible supporters of most other governments, are made up of three classes. One, knaves, a numerous and active class who see in their government an instrument which they can use for their own aggrandizement or wealth. Two, dupes, a large class, no doubt, each of whom, because he is allowed one voice out of millions in deciding what he may do with his own person and own property, and because he is permitted to have the same voice in robbing, enslaving, and murdering others that others have in robbing, enslaving, and murdering him, is stupid enough to imagine that he is a free man, a sovereign, that this is a free government, a government of equal rights, the best government on earth, and such like absurdities. I have to tell you, I mean, he saw this 80 years after the Constitution was conceived. I mean, clearly, these usurpations are not anything new for us. Spooner recognized that the Constitution was a power grab, not some noble effort to secure the blessings of freedom. The Bill of Rights, which is what most people seem to have in mind when they talk about the Constitution protecting our liberties, is a mere addendum to the document in question, a document rife with usurpations of our natural state of freedom. Neither the Constitution nor the much-lauded Bill of Rights do anything whatsoever to provide you the rights to speak freely, to bear arms, to practice the religion you choose, to associate with whom you desire, or to protect your person and belongings from unreasonable searches and seizures. These rights pre-exist the documents, and no matter how we venerate these supposed contracts, they can never justly abridge the right of a human to do as he pleases with himself and his property, provided he does not abridge the rights of another to do the same. And yet we lose sight of this. If the most prominent publication of science in the world, if the greatest scientific journal ever came out and published an article claiming that fish were feathered creatures that flew through the air, I mean, we would all immediately recognize that this is crazy, that they're wrong, it's a mistake. And yet, we not only allow the Constitution to claim that a handful of men we never voted for have the power to enslave us to the extent that they require to meet their own ends, we celebrate this as the greatest political document ever written by man. Most Americans you encounter, if asked, would say they believe there are natural, unalienable rights as described in the Declaration of Independence, rights that are inherent in our very existence, that can never be legitimately taken away. But when pressed, they come up with all sorts of exceptions. Well, yeah, you know, it is your money, but you're also part of a society, and there are poor people, and we need to take care of them. Well, yes, it is your body, but you're also part of a community, and if you ingest that, you won't be able to live up to our standards. And thanks to the Constitution, there are countless court decisions and legislative edicts and executive orders to coat those exceptions with some patina of validity. Without the Constitution or some comparable document, and without the people's irrational belief in its authority, maybe a spade would still be called a spade. Maybe redistribution of wealth would still be being called theft. Overseas intervention would be being called meddling and murder. Maybe the 4 months a year I work for no remuneration because it all goes to the IRS would be called slavery. The Constitution serves another related purpose for the usurpers. It dilutes that notion of natural rights. How much of the public debate today centers around so-called constitutional rights? Too much. Any is too much. Because the term constitutional rights is at best a misnomer, and at worst, a purposeful misdirection. The Bill of Rights never purported to grant anyone anything they didn't already possess. And yet many Americans who will talk your ear off about God-given rights and point out that their rights come from God and not government will do a mental contortionist act when you suggest suspected terrorists or illegal aliens deserve a day in court. What is there consistent Justification for denying these particular persons that day in court? Well, the Constitution doesn't apply to non-citizens or treasonous people or terrorists or name your person du jour who doesn't deserve the protection of this document. Well, I mean, maybe it doesn't apply to illegal aliens or terrorists, but then it doesn't have to. If these rights are inherent and not granted by the government, then they apply to all human beings, not just those lucky enough to have been born in this country. And if we as human beings don't have a right to have evidence of our crimes publicly heard, what other rights can possibly be secure? Did you say something the president doesn't like? Well, maybe he'll label you a terrorist and have you killed. You can say that would never happen, but you really don't know because it's all secret. Just 2 years ago, the idea that U.S. citizens would be affected by indefinite detention was being shrugged off as a ridiculous alarmism in the mainstream media. But today we have an executive branch that openly admits to maintaining a kill list and asserts the authority to execute U.S. citizens that it will determine in private proceedings deserve to be killed. Where is the protection for the man or woman who angers someone in that office? It doesn't exist. Under the Constitution's authority, and with the acquiescence of a people lulled into dispassion by their misplaced faith in its power to protect them, we have crossed a line even Stalin seems to have balked at least he wanted show trials. To describe this slope as slippery would be like describing Niagara Falls as damp. And therein lies the rub, because you can't be a little bit free any more than you can be a little bit pregnant. The Constitution seeks to abridge our freedom. It seeks to constrain us. It claims for itself the power to conscript us into wars not of our making. It claims for itself the power to confiscate our lands if the very men who want them can justify the theft to one another. It claims for itself the power to steal our earnings. It claims for itself the power to indebt our children and theirs in perpetuity. And all the while it feeds our jingoism, assuring us that nowhere is as free as here. No people are as blessed as we. It pacifies us, wraps us in a false sense of security with its lofty language of securing liberty and ensuring domestic tranquility. The Constitution may have been crafted as a fig leaf to hide the naked ambition of its authors, but we have transformed it into a Trojan horse. We have embraced it and brought it inside the city walls. We welcome it, we celebrate it, we honor it, cherish it, and idolize it. We bow to its every edict as handed down by the black-robed priests who interpret it and intercede for us when we come before them on bended knee to plead for its arbitration, to hear if this time we are worthy of this freedom or that, or must we forego liberty in this instance, deferring to the great wisdom of this magical instrument of judgment. There are two possible explanations for the evil that has spawned from the U.S. Constitution, but with only one conclusion. Either the Constitution really was supposed to create a government where the rights of the people are sacrosanct, and it has simply failed miserably, beginning before the ink was even dry, or the Constitution really was intended to subjugate the people all along, in which case it has succeeded splendidly. Whichever case is true, the path ahead must be the same. Abandon this adulation of a piece of paper that has either inadvertently or purposefully enslaved us to men not worthy of ordering a dog about, let alone a fellow sentient being. If the Constitution were only useless in defending our rights, it might be a small thing and easily overlooked, but it is far worse. It is used as an instrument of usurpation and camouflage for the ill intent of the politicians. And of course, this is not a new idea. I would like to close with Lysander Spooner's closing in The Constitution of No Authority. He stated it better than I ever could. He said, quote, "Inasmuch as the Constitution was never signed nor agreed to by anybody as a contract, and therefore never bound anybody, and is now binding upon nobody, and is moreover such a one as no people can ever hereafter be expected to consent to, except as they may be forced to do so at the point of a bayonet, it is perhaps of no importance what its true legal meaning is. Nevertheless, The writer thinks it proper to say that in his opinion, the Constitution is no such instrument as it has been generally assumed to be, but that by false interpretations and naked usurpations, the government has been made in practice a very widely and almost wholly different thing from what the Constitution itself purports to authorize. Whether the Constitution really be one thing or another, this much is certain, that it has either authorized such a government as we have, or has been powerless to prevent it. In either case, it is unfit to exist. Now, I am not suggesting that abolishing the Constitution would cure all, or even any of the ills we suffer today. I'm only offering up this criticism of the Constitution and its effects on our lives as a starting point. We don't even need to abolish it at all. We just need to break this illusion in the minds of the people that this instrument has some magical power to make us free, because it is a distraction. We are naturally free, and we need no written words to assure us of that. Our default position should be to carefully regard the natural rights of all mankind, to adhere to the principle of non-aggression, to recognize and respect self-ownership, and to demand that any curtailment of these instinctive positions be justified and left open to our consent or rejection. And finally, we should learn our lesson and pass it to our children, that we should regard with deep and abiding suspicion any document that purports to make us free by subjugating us, to enrich us by stealing from us, or to protect us by subjugating us. That's all. Thank you so much. I am not a constitutional expert, but if anyone has questions, free.
About 35 years ago, I was in law school, and in my generation, we really didn't question the government. We're not as aware, didn't have the capacity programs that these young people have. And, you know, the last few years, I've been communicating with some of the peers that I've gone to school with, a couple of friends who are judges, and we just cannot conceive of, I think the first thing that woke us up was the promulgation of the Patriot Act, which basically vitiated, eroded the very foundation of what rights that we learned in law school that deal with criminal procedure and the laws such as the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 14th Amendment. But then you start to look at the history a little better about the history of our country. If you think about monetary and fiscal policy, you think about the central bank, you think about the IRS, and there's not a single federal statute that has ever been promulgated that requires a U.S. citizen to pay federal taxes. You have my generation that basically thinks it's ridiculous that we could even to conceive that we could support this country, especially in the wake of a skirmish or a war or whatever, without having the IRS to collect taxes. It is, there's not a lot of freedom when you think about, since the inception of this country, that there is the way that it works, the logistics of it is that the few, you know, the very few that get extremely wealthy and the poor get poor. Now it's such an extreme that the middle class seems to be disappearing. In my neighborhood, there's all the homes foreclosures that have occurred, and we bail out the rich. But we've been discussing, what do they teach in law schools today? I mean, I mean, the Constitution, as we understand it, the civil rights that we have, I mean, they've been circumvented under the pretext of national security. And this is a sad time. I used to not believe that we should manage firearms. And basically didn't believe in some of the Second Amendment. I think now is not the time to take a different position. I don't believe in firearms. I don't have one, but I just think that something's what has happened. Has everybody just been asleep? My generation was. And the question I was going to ask, that I was leading to, is why is it that this generation has the capacity for this awareness that none of us had when we were in school? I mean, these two friends of mine back here, Julian and Nick, these guys, they're way ahead of me, you know. When I was their age, I didn't know anything about anything. And I didn't realize that the stuff like the false flags or you know, when I was drafted for Vietnam and that type of thing, nobody would have ever believed in this incident of war that Delta Tomlin. And it is just, I just wonder about why the awareness.
Well, I think that Stefan touched on that before me. I mean, the internet is just unbelievable. It probably gives me more hope than anything. You know, I mean, we saw even with the Arab Spring. I mean, if governments as controlling as that cannot stop people from communicating through Facebook and Twitter, you know, I am old enough to remember having to go to a library and look in an encyclopedia to do a report. And I mean, how many encyclopedias were there, and who wrote those articles and told those truths to us? I mean, today, I can go on the internet and in like 0.07 seconds, I can have 1,000, you know, different views on the same event. And it's very hard to stop. I mean, I think they want to stop it, of course, but I don't believe they'll ever be able to. I mean, I think they might imprison some people, you know, eventually, but there is just no way to stop the internet. It's just, there are too many people who know how to run their own servers and things like that. There's no way for them to keep the information in anymore. I mean, of course, with that, you have to be more judicious in what information you accept. I mean, obviously, everything on the internet is not necessarily true, but at least now we're the gatekeepers of our knowledge and not, you know, the powers that be. We have the opportunity to vet this information and decide whether it passes the smell test or not. And I mean, look, you know, I grew up with the internet and still took a knock on my door with, you know, men with guns and suits to wake me up. So, you know, I think we really become comfortable in a particular view. I mean, you're told from the time you're very little that, you know, this is great, this is great. I think like probably the thing that has, I mean, that I used to say, you know, well, at least we can complain about it. In a lot of countries, you can't even talk about it. You couldn't even say bad things about the government. And now I look back and I really cringe because I think, oh my God, that's like a rapist saying, well, at least I let her scream. You know, I mean, would we be grateful for that? You know, should we be grateful that we can stand here and talk about it? Or should we still be enraged that it's there to even talk about?
My generation is very concerned about this issue of this young man who was such a genius, just a remarkable young man that had innovative young man with software that precluded censorship on the internet, which, you know, that was really something to achieve. And then the challenge of trying to, he purportedly hung himself.
You're talking about Aaron Schwartz?
Schwartz. Yeah. Just, there's just no way. I just find that really to be a sad situation.
Yeah, and I'm sure there's malfeasance all over the place that, you know, but at least now we can find out about it.
Sure.
And we can share information. Anybody else?
Just so we got our last question before lunch, and if you have a question you didn't get it in, we are going to have a Q&A session when we get back. So here's our last question before we get back.
Okay.
First of all, thank you for your wonderful paper. It's very provocative and interesting. But I wonder, do you think that there's any respect in which the Bill of Rights restrains the state at all right now? I think about, for example, the Second Amendment. Do you think that, I mean, is there ever a day when you sort of wake up and say, well, maybe I'm so glad for that?
Well, I guess that, I guess at the point I'm coming from, and yes, I mean, I know there have been some decisions that were very promising recently, but I guess my default position is, why is the document there at all? You know, if there weren't the Constitution to append the Bill of Rights to, would we even be asking who has the right to take guns away from us? There wouldn't even be an organization that could. There wouldn't be a court to make the decision, so I guess we'd kind of just be Wild West, so. But I mean, yeah, obviously I'm glad for what it does do for us. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you.